And welcome back to this episode of Thunderstruck. As always, my name is Jake Ricker alongside my co-host Michael Wax. And today we have a special guest with us. It's Erik joining us, and you all might know him as Lightning Insider on Twitter and all that good stuff. Erik, thank you so much for coming back on the show and joining us. How you doing today?
I'm good. Hockey's around the corner. It's going to be different. It's going to be strange. But at the end of the day, we got hockey, and the Lightning have a chance to defend the cup, which is something we couldn't have said the last time they won a cup.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely excited for hockey to get right around the corner. You guys are probably going to be watching this tomorrow. So the games will be going on January 13th, Wednesday, which is the next day, hopefully when this video is up. But guys, I wanted to talk about, we just got the opening day roster basically released. They talked about who was being sent down to the minors and how that's all going to work out. So let's start talking about that to start things off. We saw a couple of number of things. I think the first thing we want to talk about here is, Mike, I'll start with you. What were some of the major things that you noticed from the roster that was released today by the Lightning?
I mean, nothing really surprised me. We were talking beforehand. I think the one thing that really surprised a lot of people was ABB not being on the main roster. But if he's going to play, he needs to play. He can't be on the taxi squad. Like, that's the one major thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that either in the AHL or the NHL, he needs ice time. But other than that, I was not really surprised by anything. You know, it's not as bad as some other teams where you're surprised who they put on waivers. The Lightning had a pretty firm roster. It was only sort of the minors of the third pair or the bottom two forward lines that actually needed some sorting out.
Also, I want to talk about this too. There was a whole situation with, so Johnson and Schenn were both sent down on waivers, and Erik, hopefully you can give us a little bit of light on this situation, because I know it's very confusing. But both Johnson and Schenn were put down on waivers, and basically the way I understand it, it's to try to alleviate some of the cap situation. It's something how the way that it works with long-term injured reserve. It's going to give the Lightning the most flexibility on the cap.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look around for my salary cap hat, because I don't think I have one. And I certainly don't have a law degree to try and figure it all out on my own. But we were able to speak with Julian Brisebois, and he tried to break it down in layman's terms for us. Basically, this is what happened. In previous years, teams were allowed to make changes to their roster 24 hours after they were set by the league. They changed that rule this year. They felt that teams were circumventing the cap a little bit by doing that. And that affected Tampa Bay drastically, because we know they have to utilize a ton of LTI space this year. So in order to maximize that, even to the point where, like, if Cal Foote didn't start on this roster to start the year, they wouldn't be able to call him up, because they wouldn't have enough cap space to be able to do it, because he's still in an entry-level contract. His bonuses, which come out to about $3.2 million if you count all those bonuses together, that would be the cap hit if he was called up after the season started. But because he's going to be start on the season to begin with, it actually helps them be able to make an emergency recall or to bring him up. So that's one aspect of it. The other part is this: you have to create as much LTI pool as you can. So it's not as simple as, okay, well, Nikita Kucherov is 9.5 and Marian Gaborik and Anders Nilsson, I'll bring it all up to about $15 million. It's not that simple. You have to push your cap up to the maximum you can to open up all that pool to utilize the LTI as the season goes along. I don't know how clearly that explains it. I might have muddied the water a little bit more, but the way I try to explain how the salary cap in the NHL works, think of a jar of coins that you have, right? Like we all used to have jars of coins, and we throw our loose change in that coin. If you had a set amount of money that you had to put into that jar each day, you throw that in each day. The less you throw in now, the more you have later. So that's also an idea here. They're trying to maximize as much space as they can, because I think they're going to end up with about 1.15 million in open space when all of this convoluted mess works itself out. That's going to give them some flexibility, not only to call players up, but potentially make a trade as we get closer to the trade deadline sometime around the second week of April. So again, very complex, very convoluted. By putting Johnson and Schenn on waivers, It opens up all that kind of space, and basically it takes them off the active roster for a couple of days. That also means that they can't play in the season opener, which is probably the one aspect of this. If they open the season on Thursday, they'd be able to play. They're opening the season on Wednesday. Those two aren't able to play because rosters are not officially due to the league until Tuesday at 5 p.m. You cannot make any roster changes now until 48 hours after that instead of what used to be 24. Did I clear it up or did I muddle it up?
I think that was a pretty good explanation. I like the example too with the coins, but I don't blame you. It is definitely a very complicated situation that I don't think almost nobody understands. But I didn't see that JBB also mentioned that, they're planning on being very close to that cap. But I think the good news for the Lightning is even though they'll be without Johnson and Shen for that opening night, is that we have a very deep team that can fill in for those guys. Michael, we did a show talking about the blue and white scrimmage that we saw, and a lot of guys seem very impressive. Who do you think is going to be someone that could jump up and join this roster?
Well, I would have said AVB, but now we know what happened there. He had some really nice plays, whether it was the breakaway or the pass to Colton. Calfoot, I think Calfoot's going to be that guy. Like we talked about it yesterday. I think that Calfoot is a really steady defenseman. And Eric, I don't know if you've had any insight to this, but it seemed like he was the guy that would stay back while Sergachev was up in the rush. That seems like the perfect Victor Hedman type defense partner too. Is there any talk of maybe putting Foot and Hedman together, maybe giving him a bit of a mentor? Because, we love Sergachev. Sergachev is a lot younger than Hedman. He still has a lot of room to grow.
The one thing to keep in mind when talking about that potential of a Foot Hedman pairing is who your opponent is, who you match up against on a nightly basis. So this is not atypical of young defensemen who come in the league. You're not throwing them out there, to send them to the wolves, I guess, for lack of a better word. Yeah, Victor Hedman's all world. He's probably the best. No, he is the best defenseman in the league. And yeah, it would make sense to put Foot on his right side, but then you have to worry about the matchup situation. So it all comes down to that. The one thing that I'm more curious to see is could you put Erik Chernak with either Sergachev or Victor Hedman? We know that they could do it. We certainly saw Sergachev and Chernak together during the playoffs at times. Ryan McDonagh actually, to me, feels like he'd be more suited to play alongside because it takes a special mentality to play with a guy like Victor Hedman. He roams the ice so much. What normally might be out of position for a lot of other defensemen is just Victor Hedman being Victor Hedman, but his partner has to read off that. That's why Anton Strawman was so good paired alongside Victor Hedman. In a lot of ways, that's why Jan Ruda, especially when you look at the analytics numbers, tells you that he's a good partner for Victor Hedman in that aspect, because you have to be able to read off a guy like Victor. So you want to bring your young defenseman along slowly. You don't want to feed him too much. We saw the philosophy they had this with Sergachev his rookie year. You go look at it. His ice time his rookie year was about 14, 15 minutes. Then it was 17, and last year it was 20. So you start to just kind of, okay, we're going to give you this. Can you handle this? Okay, you handle that. Let's move on. Can you handle this a little bit more? So it's a progression thing. And this coaching staff has shown over the number of years that they've been here that that's how they want to deal with things. And so that's why I would look for most likely partners for Foot, at least to start, will be Sergachev or McDonagh. And of course, we saw the two of Sergachev and Foot paired in the final scrimmage.
I would imagine too, it's safe to say that obviously with COVID, everything's going to be very crazy in this shortened season, that things will probably continue to change throughout the season, because if players do end up going out due to COVID-19 or whatever it may be, I'm sure we'll see those pairs constantly changing and things moving around. The Lightning will have to test out and see what they like the best. But I do like the idea of Chernak jumping in on some of those pairs as well. We mentioned ABB a couple of times. Eric, I'd like to ask you, what do you think prevented ABB from ultimately making the opening night roster? I think there's a couple of reasons. I think Matthew Joseph's performance in the scrimmage games, he looked really good last night in the blue and white scrimmage game. I think that might have something to do with him taking a spot there. And then really there's not too many spots for these young guys to pick up overall.
No, I think there's two factors with Alex barré-boulet. Number one, the business side of it, because both Joseph and Volkov are no longer waiver exempt. So you would have to put them through waivers to try and send them down or to put them on the taxi squad. You risk losing them. So that takes that out of the equation. Barré-boulet is still on his entry-level contract. you don't have to worry about it. The second part is you're just waiting for barré-boulet to just have a moment, right? To jump out at you. And he didn't have it last year in camp when he was coming off that Rookie of the Year campaign in the AHL. That's why he was actually among one of the first ones sent back to Syracuse. And he had a couple of moments in that final scrimmage, but like it wasn't a moment where you're like, okay, he belongs. So like that's kind of the moment you're looking for. I think back, I'm not comparing the two, but Braden Point's second training camp. You just watch that kid play and you're like, wow, he gets it. And he didn't even make the team that year. They actually sent him back to junior for his final year. But you could see those moments of those players. You can tell when they're starting to make their presence known. I think we're still waiting for that for him. He'll probably get that chance at some point this year. I think with the COVID situation, and it's hard to see all teams being immune from this situation. So he'll get his chance. There's 13 forwards, 14 forwards if you count the taxi squad. He's right in that mix. I think he'll get a chance at some point this year. But again, you're just waiting for that moment to say, aha, okay, now he gets it.
Yeah, I think we saw, not to bring up Cal Foot again, but it seemed like Cal Foot got it, like this training camp. Like that game last night was one of his best that I've seen at any level, just looking at him overall. But I did have a question regarding, the taxi squad. This is something very new to, I think, everybody. When you think about it from the grand scheme of things, we saw players get put on waivers for the purposes of being on that taxi squad potentially for, I'm not going to say Wednesday, but after Wednesday. And then we saw people get sent down for outright minors. If there's a person like a Matthew Joseph or an Alex Volkov that has a slow start in the NHL, is there something that prevents them from putting them in the minors or the taxi squad? What would be the difference between them putting them on the taxi squad or putting them in the outright minors?
For transactional purposes, there's no difference. They're treating the players on the taxi squad as if you send them to the minors. That's why if you want to send a player to the taxi squad, you have to put them through waivers if they're not waiver exempt. So you look at who they have on it. It's going to start, at least anyway, it's going to start with Tyler Johnson, Luke Shen, Jamel Smith, Ben Thomas, Andreas Borgman, and then the required one goaltender is going to be Christopher Gibson. For transactional purposes, they'll be treated just like in the American Hockey League. They're going to get paid. So if you're on a two-way deal, you're going to get paid your American Hockey League salary and not your NHL salary. And if you require waivers, you have to go on waivers, just like Smith. All those guys have to go through waivers to get to the taxi squad. But then the taxi squad and the AHL, they're interchangeable. So if you want to take a Jamel Smith, okay, he sat here for a month, he hasn't played, we need to get him some games. You can send him to Syracuse and bring another player onto the taxi squad. So it is interchangeable in that aspect. And then it's just a paper transaction. If you want to pull one of those guys up and put them on your active roster, you just have to have the space. The 23-man roster is still set. That hasn't changed. It's the only difference is that these 4 to 6 guys that these teams are allowed to carry will actually practice with the big team and they will travel with the big team. I wouldn't be surprised if they make sure that group is separated as much as possible from the main group. I even saw something today that the Bruins are going to make sure that Jarl Halak and Tuukka Rask are away from each other. So if one gets it, they don't have to both quarantine, and you're stuck with something else. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot more teams do something like that, and that includes these taxi squad guys, because if you have 3 guys that are have to sit out because of close contact, you want to be able to bring players in right away to be able to fill out a full roster.
Absolutely. That brings up an interesting question, I think. So, obviously we don't know at what point the NHL will decide to cancel games, postpone games, or just you have to use your players on the taxi squad, excuse me. We saw that with Dallas, who had 6 players test positive and 2 coaches as well. Those games got postponed, one of them being for the Lightning, and potentially we could get that second one that they're supposed to play on the 19th postponed, depending on how things play out. So I don't know if you know or if you have any insight on this. At what point do you think, how many COVID tests does a team need for them to say, okay, maybe you really can't use your taxi squad at this point, we just need to postpone or possibly cancel games?
Yeah, that's really a tough one. I don't know what that threshold is. I mean, if you look at what the NBA is going through, they had to cancel a couple of games on Monday. Today, as we're talking about it, was on Monday because the teams didn't have enough active players to be able to play the games. The NBA requires you to have at least 8. These teams had not necessarily positive cases, but because of contact tracing, you have to isolate and quarantine them. So It's like I find it hard for the NHL. I mean, the locker rooms are not that big. You have, especially with the Lightning, because they're doing something they're not used to doing, and that's sharing a facility with an NBA team because the Raptors are still in town at least through the beginning of March. So they're going to be moving in and out. So it's not like you can use one of the other locker rooms and try and keep people separated from each other. So it's difficult. It's going to be hard. I think that just as we've seen in the early stages of camp, because not only did you have Dallas, of course, they had the positive test that shut them down and postponed at least 3 games. You had Pittsburgh have to call off a practice, but they were all fine the next day. We saw Columbus have to pull 17 players away from practice because of contact situations. They came back okay, and Vancouver went through the same thing. If you have one of those situations like Columbus had, where you got to pull 16 players away, you can't play a game. And in this schedule, like if you just look at the Dallas schedule, compare it to the Lightning schedule, and figure out where you can just make up this one game, doesn't even count the 2 games Dallas was supposed to play against the Panthers. There's really not a whole lot of space on this truncated schedule to fit in one extra game because you can't play 3 nights in a row. The CBA forbids that. There's like one open date that I was able to find where you could make up this game, and that is not until the beginning of March. And what that's going to end up doing, Tampa Bay has, they would end up being 2 games against Dallas on Monday, Tuesday. They would have Wednesday off. They would have to play in Chicago Thursday and Friday, and then play a 3rd game against Chicago on Sunday. It's 5 games in 7 days. It's very taxing, but looking at the schedule, if they're not going to be open to maybe pushing back, create a little bit of a cushion in the schedule to allow for some of these games to be made up, they're going to have a hard time finding it if more than a few teams start to have games that are going to have to be postponed or rescheduled. It's a difficult situation logistically.
Yeah, I mean, I hope none of that happens, but this is the situation that we're dealing with. Hopefully this is the last, COVID related question that we're going to ask you about before we get into hopefully happier stuff about the team. But you've been in the arena for some of the practices and especially the scrimmage. Was there anything that you saw that was different to the way that the team practiced and played during the normal circumstances? I'm not talking so much about, mask mandate or, a potential like separation if they had to do that. But is there something different that you saw in practice protocols?
Not on the ice, other than that the coaches are supposed to wear masks out there, and we've seen that. We've seen masks on the coaches, but beyond that, everything looks like it's status quo on the ice. Obviously, we don't have access to the locker room to see the protocols that take place down there. We won't have that for the entire season. Everything is going to be done virtually in terms of any sort of communication with coaches, players, staff, anything like that. Nothing that you could see. It looked very similar to the summer camp back in July when the team was here for a couple of weeks before they went up to Toronto to get in the bubble. So that like the drills are the same, the contact is set. Like I haven't seen players separated, because of that. The scrimmage last night is the same thing. There were no certain different protocols other than the mask being worn by staff members while they're on the bench. I think that's the only thing that you're going to notice differently on the surface. Everything else is behind the scenes because like they're encouraging, if players want to shower at home after the game, they're not going to be dissuaded from doing that. They're making sure only so many players can be in the showers at a time after games. They're making sure that, the cold tubs or the hot tubs, you can only have 1 or 2 maximum in there at a time. The weight rooms is limited, I think, to 10 players in there at a time. So there are a lot of things they're doing behind the scenes. It's just we don't have access to that to see it. We just know that those are the policies.
Speaking of being inside the arena for that blue white scrimmage, we heard on the television last night that it sounds like the Lightning were testing out some crowd noise in the background. I'd love to get your thoughts on this because you were there. It sounded like to me on TV they definitely have some work to do with making that all work out. But because a couple of times it sounded like it was really loud at a couple of times and it was off. But how did that sound actually being in the arena?
It didn't sound natural. Obviously, it's not. They're piping it in, but the game is so fast. Like this is not soccer where, there's a slow build up and you can get ready for an anticipation of something like that. It's certainly not the NFL where there's an anticipation of something happening. You don't know when something's going to happen. So it's like, Yanni Gourde was even asked about this on the Zoom call afterwards. He's like, the players kind of looked around and said, well, why is that sound being played now? Because it's so far behind the play at times. It felt awkward. We'll see what it looks like on Wednesday. Obviously, it's going to be different because the telecast is going to be on NBC Sportsnet. They'll pipe in probably their own crowd noise through the TV channels rather than what's in the arena. I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to what it's going to be like in an empty arena. Like I've never seen the Lightning play another team in an empty arena before. It's going to be strange. It's going to be bizarre from that aspect. But yeah, the crowd noise they definitely do have a lot of work to do on it. It just didn't feel natural in the way that you would want it to feel in an unnatural situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure Emily and the Lightning and everybody are hoping that we can get fans back inside the arena. I know we unfortunately had to, the team put that on pause due to the rising COVID cases, but hopefully they won't have to do that for too long. We get at least some fans back inside the arena. A couple more things I want to talk about before we wrap things up. I want to ask you this on a happy, as you were talking, Michael. We've talked about some of the players that could potentially jump up, players that are on the taxi squad that might have to fill in for players. Michael, I'll start with you. Who's your potential MVP, the standout guy that you think could show up this season and ultimately help the Lightning get back into the playoffs? Because we talked about this on some of our other shows. This is going to be a tough year, obviously, with the COVID situation. And, the division is, a pretty good division that we're in.
Yeah, well, if you're talking to MVP, we talked about this before Eric even came on the show. Mikhail Sergachev, Victor Hedman Andre Vasilevsky, Victor Hedman are your two MVPs. Either of them goes down, that's a massive hit to your defense and your goaltending. As far as someone that would be able to take over, like you wouldn't think about, I think Mikhail Sergachev is going to take another step this season. There is a lot of questions about that right side of the defense. At some point, you can't keep all three because they do have a massive cap hit between all three of them. And I think Sergachev is going to show that he's much more capable of that top four role than in previous seasons. He took a major step this year. If he's on power play one, like he was in some practices that we saw, I think that is going to make an even bigger player than, what we've seen before.
Eric, what about you? Do you have any possible standout MVPs that you could see jumping up this season?
I look for Steven Stamkos. As crazy as it is to say, he missed the playoffs really, other than 2 minutes and 50 seconds of glorious hockey. We didn't see him at all. He went down before the pause hit, had to recover from the first surgery, didn't quite go as well, had the second surgery. I'm happy for him because he was able to at least get into that game and contribute with a goal that we're going to remember for a long, long time. So he felt he had a contribution to that. But there's a hunger inside of him that I think we're going to see a little bit more this year, especially with Nikita Kucherov out. I think he's going to take on some of that responsibility. He's a different type of player for sure. He's a shooter and not a playmaker like Kucherov is. And those two feed off each other so well in the power play. But I look for him to have a big year. I think he's got something to prove. He's got a hunger inside of him that he wasn't able to really kind of push forward with last year because of the contributions that he wasn't able to give in the postseason. I look for him to have a monster year.
And that would be huge for Lightning, especially as the captain. We know how important that is in the locker room and that chemistry, especially with this crazy season. So, Michael, before we wrap this up, you have anything else to add?
No, but you did mention Steven Stamkos, Eric. I do want to, shout out your article that you did on lightninginsider.com. There's Steven Stamkos. Really, it was a book, basically. It was a tremendous read. I laughed, I cried. Like it was so well done. I'm so happy that he was looking to open up to somebody about some of the struggles that he went through, both personal and injury wise. So I thank you for really letting the entire Lightning community share that, get to be able to experience that.
Well, thank you very much. And I thank Steven for allowing that opportunity to have that type of an interview and share some very personal aspects with, between him and his wife and his family and everything that obviously pulled him out of the bubble for a couple of weeks. But also to share some laughter too, as you mentioned. I thought that was great. The story, the shower scene, and in game 6 when the game went into double overtime, I thought that was hilarious and good. But I appreciate that, and I'm glad that he was willing to share that story with me so that I could share it with everybody else.
Well, I think that's just going to about do it for us guys today. So if you guys did enjoy this episode, please be sure to leave a like down below. Let's just help us out in the YouTube algorithm. Lets us know that you are enjoying this content. Be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss out on future videos like this. Erik, thank you so much for coming on and joining us again. If you guys want to check out any of his stuff, I'm going to link his Twitter, his website. He's got his own podcast as well that I'll link down below, so you can go check that out. But thank you so much for coming on and joining us.
My pleasure. And don't forget the book. The book is still out there.
Yes.
And if anybody is interested in getting the signed copy of it for $25, I will mail you a signed copy of it. You can email me, Erik@lightninginsider.com, or send me a DM on Twitter.
Absolutely. All right. So remember, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And remember, your Tampa Bay Lightning are going to be, just in a couple of days here, you're defending Stanley Cup champions.